Welcome, guys. Welcome to our webinar, Providing Quality End-of-Life Care to the Asian American Community. Thank you for joining us today with your busy schedule. My name is Aminata Diallo. I am the Program Manager for the Center for Learning at Montgomery Hospice and Prince George's Hospice. The Center for Learning strives to educate our community about end-of-life care, advanced care planning, and grief issues. If you're new to our program, we welcome you. We're so glad you can be with us today. We are expecting about 130 participants mixed with community and professionals from the area. I see we have people from Bethesda, Baltimore, Holy Cross, Capital Caring. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us. My role here today is to handle the behind the scene logistic of the webinar. We want this to be very interactive, so we want you guys to engage with us in the chat box. So just keep in mind to have all your audio devices off so we have your undivided attention for an hour. You might see me and my colleague Alejandra pop up in the chat box to help address any issues or any questions you may have. The chat box is accessible through the messaging icon. Thank you ahead of time for any issues we have ahead of time. I will come back at the end of the webinar to talk about our evaluation. To start off, I am going to introduce our moderator and panelist, Isabel Tom. Isabel is the former program manager for the Center for Learning at Montgomery Hospice and Prince George Hospice. She grew up in a multi-generational household. Through her personal experience, caregiving and professional work in the senior living and hospice field was inspired to author. The Value of Wrinkles, a young perspective on loving the old will change your life. Isabel holds a Master's of Public Health from the University of Maryland. Thank you, and Isabel, I'll hand it off to you now.
Thank you, Aminata and Montgomery Hospice for hosting this awesome program today. As Aminata mentioned, I used to work at Montgomery Hospice, and so I'm glad that they allowed me to come back even just for today. So I want to welcome all of you participants here today. I think we have about 52 of you right now, and we're expecting a lot more. And as I hop in, I welcome all of you to just interact with us in the chat box. Thank you for having an interest in this topic today, because I think just the fact that you are showing up, to me, that shows that you're a good professional, that you want to provide better care to the Asian American community and that you want to understand the Asian American community more. So we're going to go through the objectives really quick. We have a great conversation to go through. Aminata, would you mind switching to the next slide? And just real quick, what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to first discuss a major challenge with serving the Asian American community. We're going to talk about some of the similarities across the Asian American community. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that Asian American patients and their families face, some misconceptions that we thought were really interesting that we wanted you to know about, and how it affects the Asian American community in regard to healthcare services and end-of-life care. And then we're going to give you some takeaways that we hope will be valuable to you. So as you can see, there's 3 panelists here, and initially we had intended, or we had scheduled four people to be on the panel. Dr. Mei-Cheng Lee had a last-minute emergency, and unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today. Aminata is going to be including a link to some of her research that she has done in an email after this program. And so I would highly encourage you to look at this research. Today, we're really sharing 3 different perspectives in our stories, but Dr. Lee has done research on the Chinese American community specifically and advanced care planning. So we would love for you to check that out. So I'm going to briefly introduce to you Elaine, Kim, and Meghna. Meghna, how do you pronounce your last name? I forgot to ask you.
Taneja.
Taneja. All right. And so they are both professionals. All of us are professionals who have worked in end-of-life care at Montgomery Hospice. And we also have a caregiving story. So I really hope that you would listen today, and hopefully you can gather some tips for the Asian American patients and families that you serve. So we're going to get into more of our stories later on, but just to give you a brief overview. I'm sorry, I hear some audio. All right, Elaine Kim, she has worked as a bereavement counselor with Montgomery Hospice for 5 years. She is a licensed master of social work and has worked extensively with grieving adults of diverse backgrounds, both individually and in groups. And she has provided numerous grief workshops and supportive events in a variety of settings across Montgomery County. So thank you, Elaine, for coming today and being part of this panel. Meghna has worked in the Education and Outreach Department at Montgomery Hospice and Prince George's Hospice. I forgot to include that part of the name, for over 2 years. She has a BA in sociology and has taken classes specific to gerontology and death. She has volunteer experience at an adult daycare, and she grew up in a multi-generational family. She has led advanced care planning trainings and facilities and has facilitated several education programs on hospice and end of life topics. So let's just get into this. You're going to learn more about their stories as we go along and we discuss these different topics, and I'm really excited for that. So we're going to start talking about a major challenge in serving the Asian American community. Now, if you have ever struggled with how to provide quality care at the end of life to the Asian American community, this is why. Because there's so much diversity across the Asian American population. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and I will conclude at the end, to tell us your story, tell us about your ethnic heritage so that we can get to know you a little bit more. And then if you can you tell us, what do you identify yourself as? Do you identify yourself as Asian, American, both? And let's just kind of get into this topic. So Meghna, I'm going to ask if you would share first.
Sure. That's quite a bit to cover, so I'll try and not miss anything. But I guess it starts with my grandparents. They both actually lived in Pakistan pre-partition in the 1940s, and both my sets of grandparents ended up making homes in New Delhi, India, which is the capital. And both my parents grew up in New Delhi, India. My grandpa first immigrated over here through his job and brought my dad and two of his sisters. And then after marriage, my mom joined my dad a couple of years later. And so they've been in this area, actually. I grew up in Montgomery County. They've been in this area since the 1980s, mid 1980s. I grew up with a lot of culture in the home. My dad's parents lived with us, and that is very common in Indian culture. He was the eldest. He was the only son, but also the eldest. And so generally the parents live with the eldest child or the eldest son. And so I had the privilege of living with my grandparents and learning a lot about our culture, our history, mythology, the language. My grandma barely spoke. She really didn't speak much English, and my grandpa tried and learned enough to kind of get by, answer the phone, and help out with school issues. So I really was raised primarily by my grandpa because both of my parents were working full time, and both of my grandparents had several health issues. In the 90s, it was my grandma in the 90s and early 2000s. And then my grandpa had Alzheimer's definitely from 2007 onwards, but we suspect it may have been dementia beforehand or memory loss from 2004 off and on, just little things. So we have always kind of had caregiving in our story living here. And before it was my parents only, but then as I got older and because of my close relationship with my grandpa and just all of us feeling the need to do whatever we could to help out, I was a very, very active participant in his caregiving as an Alzheimer's patient. And he was at home the whole time. We ended up getting a caregiver to live with us for the last 6 months to help us out with some of the bathroom needs and the 24/7 care that none of us could provide, with me being in high school and my parents being at their jobs. So that that's kind of a precursor for my caregiving story. We'll probably get into it in some stories later on in the webinar.
Thank you, Meghna. And can you tell us really quick, how would you identify yourself? Would you consider yourself Asian American? What do you consider yourself?
I think if I was, it's a really interesting question. I think if I was younger, I may have called myself more of an American, just from that need to kind of assimilate and be part of the rest of what everyone else is, and what you learn in school. You want to fit in. You want to fit in so badly. But I think because I was so intertwined with my culture growing up, going to events and wearing the clothes, being lucky enough to visit my grandparents in India, my maternal grandparents in India, and speaking the language at home, I think now I'm an Indian first and an American second, but it's so intertwined. I learned both languages at the same time, and I really consider myself Asian American. I can't really call myself one more than the other because they're both such a big part of who I am.
Thanks for sharing, Meghna. We really appreciate it. Elaine, can you tell us some of your story? And then again, I can ask you the question about identity at the end if you have time to share that.
Sure. Yeah, my family came from South Korea in 1974. So it was quite a while ago. It was a very poor country then, and my parents were, from a very, from difficult economic circumstances like most of the country, and had very little formal education. But my father did some work helping and supporting the US troops in Vietnam. So I think that gave him a little bit of a help in order to get his family over here, and they came, and I was born shortly thereafter in New Jersey. So, I was the only child born and raised in this country. My siblings were teenagers at the time, and, being pretty limited in their experience of the outside world. My parents had no idea what they were in for coming to this country, had no idea how different the values and the culture would be, and the challenge, of raising a child in two cultures. So yeah, it's been a journey. And I would say that, my family, because of the time that they immigrated, the age they were, their story is going to be very different from a more recent immigrant family, from the same country. My dad was a veteran of the Korean War, and that kind of comes into my story a little bit, and I'll share more about that later. But he died with Montgomery Hospice care in 2017 of liver cancer. And I was a caregiver for him along with my mom in the home. And yeah, that's a big part of my story. So in terms of your final question, Isabel, just like Meghna was saying, it's really not possible to say, what I'm more of. And I think as I get older, I tend to get more and more further away from like kind of dualistic thinking, right? It has to be one or the other. And I don't think that's true. So I feel 100% American. I feel 100% Korean most of the time. And then often I feel a little bit outsider. So, it's like everything and so.
So it's really complex.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah.
And I think that's how it would be with each of our stories. You saw that map before, and you saw, Asia is the largest continent and it's the most populous continent. So if you have ever struggled with serving the Asian American community, again, this is one of the major reasons why. In terms of my story, I am Chinese American and my family speaks Cantonese. I grew up in a multi-generational household. My parents came over here for school. My dad came over here for college, and he got his graduate degrees here, and then they met here. My grandparents came over before I was born. And so I say, from the time I was born, my grandparents were already living in my house, and that was life for me. So it was very different than a lot of my friends at school, but I lived in the same household as my grandparents until I was 26 and helped to care for my grandparents. They lived for a long, long time. So they lived until 98 and 102. And my sisters and I, we took a huge part in that caregiving process, like Meghna was saying. And I think it was a family affair for us. Our parents kind of showed us that it was, and they didn't necessarily tell me that it was my job, but I felt like it was my role to help care for my grandparents. Part of my caregiving story also involves my dad. So when my grandma turned 100, a month before my dad passed away from cancer. So obviously you can tell this is hard to talk about at times, right? This is our family. And I think for Asian Americans, especially, our family is very important to us. So like I was saying, it's not, there's so much diversity within the Asian American community. And so when you are meeting or serving an Asian American patient, I think it's important to look at them and then look at their family and to know that there's diversity within a family. And so that's why the family dynamic is just so interesting. But we shared a slide about the country of origin, but there are other factors that affect, who that person is as an Asian American. So I also want to point out that you'll notice that the title of this talk, we use the term Asian American, and you may have heard the term AAPI, which is Asian American Pacific Islander. And one of the reasons why we didn't use that term is because, at least in this program, we didn't have somebody who was represented on our panel from the Pacific Islander group. And so you may find similarities, but we just didn't want to misrepresent the Pacific Islander group. So I'm gonna go on because we have a lot to talk about. We are different, as you can see, and you're going to learn more about that, but yet there's so many similarities. So these are some of the similarities that we found as we were talking to each other, as we were doing research, things like filial piety, which I think just a general way to explain it is just like respect for your elders, honor for your elders. Dignity is something important to us. We're very family oriented. Devotion and sacrifice can kind of characterize us. And then talking about end of life wishes is taboo. And for those of you who are familiar with end of life, then you're like, it's taboo everywhere. But we're going to kind of get into that a little bit more. So in this discussion, I want to talk next and ask Meghna and Elaine, and again, I'll share again at the end, as you are caring for your loved ones, like when you look at this list of similarities, do any of these resonate with you, or as you were caring for your loved ones? So Elaine, why don't you go first for that one?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. All of these are very relevant. And I agree that, even though the countries are very different that we listed, these are, I would say, in my experience, very common among the Asian American community. So filial piety is central to a lot of Asian cultures. And I'll speak for mine. In the Korean culture, it is expected that the child will do and sacrifice almost anything to keep their parents healthy and happy. And that is not one-sided. I want to share, especially for my parents' generation, marriage was not a romantic notion of spending the rest of your life with your soulmate. I mean, marriage was to have children, to further the line, and then to give your children the best opportunities possible to succeed. And parents were expected to sacrifice their own happiness, their own pursuits in order to do that. So it is really what the children are expected to do in return is to give that same devotion and sacrifice to their parents. And the dignity piece comes in because, families and older generation Asians, it's very important that they maintain their status, as the head of the family, and saving face is an important aspect of a lot of Asian cultures, not getting too worked up about things and not being too emotional. And so that how they interplay is interesting because for, I would say, especially men, for whom being stoic about death is kind of an admired quality, and they should accept their death with grace. It would be unseemly for them to admit that they didn't want to die, that they were afraid to die, or even that they want to do everything they can to live. In some situations, they're not able to say that themselves. At the same time, a child, a son or daughter, is probably not going to be able to even talk about their parents' death as an actuality or something that they're accepting of, because that is almost perceived as a betrayal, and that could be perceived from the outside or even just internally. You feel like you're betraying your parents by even implying that you'd be okay with them, getting sick or dying, so obviously it makes it very difficult to try to talk honestly or openly about end of life wishes, or circumstances. So that, all of these apply, but that particularly is, relevant in my mind and my family, as well as the talking about end of life being taboo. I know that it's sometimes considered bad luck, like you are bringing some bad thing to happen if you talk about it. But also I want to share, about my father's history in the Korean War, which, many people don't know about. And I personally didn't even really know much about it until I was an adult and my dad was sick, and I wish I had asked him more about it. But he saw a lot of death and violence, in his early 20s. The Korean War was very brutal. In his regiment of 50 men, there was a handful of men left. And so I think, from a pretty non-religious background where death is part of nature, but also a little bit vague and kind of a frightening idea, that was even more reason that he didn't want to talk about death, is because he was traumatized, by the circumstances in his country as he was growing up. So,
thank you for sharing that, Elaine. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
I think if you talk to other Asian Americans, and at least for me, I grew up in the US, and so I'm considered American-born Chinese, and I think the stories and the trauma that our parents and grandparents experienced, a lot of times we don't hear about it. And so that adds another dynamic to it. I also want to point out that Dr. Lee, although she wasn't able to be here, we read her research, and one of the articles that Amina is going to share with you is it's titled Beliefs in Advanced Care Planning Among Chinese Americans, Similarities and Differences Between the Younger and Older Generation. And just to summarize, one of the things that she found as she was talking to the younger and older generation is the reluctance to talk about end-of-life wishes, but the acceptance that is so very important. And one of the things that she brought up is that filial piety is one of the things that made talking about it with each other so difficult. So a lot of times the younger generation wanted to talk about it, but they didn't want to disrespect their elders, and that was filial piety. And then, the older generation also didn't want to bring it up out of respect for the younger generation too. So I have done talks when I was at Montgomery Hospice for the Chinese community, and even though it's taboo, it was interesting. We had so many people attend these programs that we did on end-of-life wishes and advanced care planning. And so sometimes I think it does take a trusted in-between person. And I'll just, before we get onto Meghna sharing her story, I'll just share the story with my family. Is my grandpa, he lived till he was 98. And even when he had a stroke at 97, he refused to sign a power of attorney. And so my dad was really worried about what would happen because his wife was still living and he was in control of everything. And so it ended up being that I, as a grandchild, I think my dad didn't want to upset my grandpa. And so I kind of told my dad, I said, I'm going to talk to him about it. And so that's how we ended up getting the form signed. But it was definitely something, like Elaine was saying, that if you bring it up, you could cause a lot of conflict in the family that I don't think we're usually used to or we want to do. So Meghna, I'm going to go ahead and let you share your story real quick as well.
Sure. And to add on to that, Isabel, we experienced that as well. It's on top of, just the general despair that comes with choosing to talk about death or hospice or, advanced care planning before it becomes necessary. It's not all members of the family may be on the same page. Not all members of the family may have the same understanding of the services that are provided. And at least for my family, we did not, this wasn't our healthcare system. So there was a lot to learn. You kind of learn on a different curve than everyone else. And that played a factor in our story. But I wanted to kind of add a disclaimer at this slide that, these similarities here are not written in stone, and they shouldn't be assumed as commonplace for all Asian families. Some of these may be present in a story and some of them may not. These are ones that we found in common with ours and in our research, but the most important thing is to not assume and to really learn more about the patient and the family that you are treating and dealing with. So for me, I would say there was a power, in a sense, of the taboo subject, like Elaine talked about. It kind of silences both sides of the conversation between patient and the healthcare professional. Patient doesn't, Asian American patient doesn't want to talk about this topic, and healthcare professional doesn't want to make the family uncomfortable or may not have experience talking to this particular community and not knowing what might offend them and what might not. So that's automatically a silencer in conversation, just from that fear of overstepping. And for my family, I would say that the ones that most presented themselves, all of them really did, but the ones that most presented themselves would be the devotion and sacrifice, and dignity, and then to a lesser extent, well, actually family oriented. It's all family oriented. We all had a role to play in taking care of my grandparents, and I was young when my grandma was sick. She dealt with a lot of health issues from before I was born, really, to 2003 when she died, and when I was, I think, 9 or 8. I wasn't that involved in her care, and I didn't understand what happened there. But even then, the day that she died, my parents didn't want me to come home and see her going into an ambulance. And so there's that protection also, of your children and of this concept of death. And the devotion and sacrifice, I mean, it starts very, very early on. My grandpa took care of a lot of his siblings, and not just monetarily, but in love and across countries and across continents, and that carries forward in the values that you pass on to your kids and your grandkids. And so we grew up, loving and seeing how our grandparents and parents nurtured us and walked us to school every day and all of that. And you want to give that back, and you want to do anything to make them comfortable. So when my grandpa had Alzheimer's and he knew what was happening, he had a great memory and he loved telling stories. So he was very much aware of what was going on, and he was not okay with it. There was a lot of dignity. There was a lot of fear for him in the fact that he was losing this part of his body, his cognitive function that was always so strong. And so he did not want that to be shared. When we had guests come over, he knew how to turn the conversation around so that they wouldn't realize that he didn't remember their name. He would call them beta, which means child, and it's a generic term that everyone smiles and responds to. So people didn't always realize that he had started to forget names and things like that. And it came from that place of, we don't want people to worry about us. We don't want people to be too concerned. It's let's keep it in the family and see if we can and take care of it on our own. That falls back into the devotion and sacrifice of my parents and I thinking and talking, what can we do to take care of him at home for as long as possible, because he knows Hindi best and English was his second language, third really, and we speak his language. So that was a big factor. But on top of that, there was comfort. He knew us. We were the last things that he held on to and remembered. And for a patient with Alzheimer's, it's important for them to have that structure. So we really didn't want him moved or anything like that. So my dad was one of the first people in his office to work from home back in 2007. It was a pilot program in the federal government, and he was one of the first. He put in a request and explained the family situation, and that my grandpa would need overseeing. He had started to get lost in the neighborhood, and it was a neighborhood he knew really well and walked in every day, so we were concerned. And my mom switched jobs. She moved to a job that was 10 minutes away instead of an hour away in DC. And I was in high school, so there wasn't much I could do, but I stopped thinking about or doing anything related to after school activities. The only thing I did was band, and that was because band practice ended in time for me to catch the bus to come home and watch over my grandpa, and help out with that. And then what I did in my summer was I went to an adult daycare and volunteered there to help my grandpa also get assimilated there, because we knew he needed to be watched from 9 to 3, and we weren't able to cover that with me going to school and my parents working. So we all made little sacrifices of devotion, I like to think of it, despite the limitations that our jobs or our school or whatever were kind of throwing our way. We tried to make it work as long as we could.
Before we go on, Isabel, can I just make one point? I think I saw in the chat from Meghna, asking how a chaplain can talk about end of life, because it's taboo. But I just want to make the distinction that really it's most taboo within the family to talk about it. So like you were talking about, Isabel, like there's an opportunity for an outsider to come in to talk about death in a way that the family cannot talk to each other about. So that's
yes, and that's so true. I think you can kind of, if you are a trusted professional and you show you truly care, I think you can step in, and I don't want to make it sound like maybe this is the wrong word, but you can be almost like a lifesaver by initiating that conversation, because we don't want to bring it up. And I also one of the similarities I just want to share, Richard Louie, who is an MSNBC news anchor, he actually just came out with a book, and he is a caregiver for his dad, who has Alzheimer's. He wrote a book called Enough About Me. And I think that kind of like encompasses it. But he, was working full time, and he asked, I think in his industry, it is not normal to ask for a part-time job, but he talked to his boss about working part-time so that he could go visit his dad and fly to visit his dad. So I think that is one of the most beautiful things that I'm proud of to be Asian American, because I see that devotion and sacrifice. So we're going to get into the challenges now and address some of the challenges that come with serving Asian American patients and families. And maybe you're already like, there's too much already. But as many of you know, there have been a lot of discriminatory events towards Asian Americans. And we're not going to necessarily talk about those events, but we're just going to bring up the challenges and struggles that Asian Americans may have when receiving end-of-life care and healthcare in general, because I think we don't talk about our stories that often. I have worked with Elaine and Meghna, and this is the first time I've heard their story. So I don't think it's something where we like grab the mic and make sure that everybody knows about it. So I think you're going to gain a lot from this. So can you guys, Elaine and Meghna, share what are the challenges that you have seen as you have cared for your loved ones? And if you have examples, please share. You've already been sharing stories, so please share that. Why don't we start with Elaine?
Sure. Obviously, the most obvious challenge is the language barrier that can sometimes exist, in serving Asian American families. But that is just one factor. Socially, I think there is a generalization that Asians are quiet and undemanding. They don't seem to make a lot of waves. And maybe people interpret that to mean that they don't really want you interfering. But there are some dynamics there that people may not be aware of. And culturally, the Asian culture is more likely to respect authority and want to maintain kind of like the peace and harmony in a system. So that's why they're not likely to say when they're unhappy with something or when they need something. So I think it's good for workers to recognize that they might need to really be proactive in trying to find out what a family needs. So it's also important to note that biologically, we might have some biases. Asians are smaller, generally, less intimidating to look at and, to be in the presence of. And so, that can have an unconscious effect on how people treat us. And we're not the only ones that know that, So I'll give an example. When my father was in the hospital at one point, there was a male nurse aide who I thought was being a little rough with him, and I said so. And this nursing aide kind of looked at me with kind of a jeer, and it seemed like he became even rougher. And was challenging me, to say something, and this is the kind of microaggressions that are very hard to report. And I don't think he would have done that if we had been a white family. I think, he was aware that, like him, we were a minority and our, complaints would not be taken as seriously as it would have come from, someone from the dominant culture. It's very unfortunate, because even for people who are not racist, it can be a convenient way to take out, aggressions or frustrations, on families that, don't have as much power, in the situation. So that kind of touches on some of the challenges.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm just going to briefly, we had just one question that Brittany had about explaining what looking less threatening looks like. Do you want to address that, or I can too?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, in addition to Asians generally being kind of smaller, right? There's also research that shows that people respond differently when, a face's features are more like a child's, And, the fact of it is that Asians have these rounder faces, like flatter bridge of the nose and brow. And, it's easy, it's benign often, people think, oh, how cute, or they just assume maybe that that person doesn't have the full range of human emotions and experiences. And I know that sounds silly, but these are all kind of unconscious effects that happen, in our brains just because, we're human. And just to be aware of it, I think is important. But those are reasons, sometimes why people can feel like, they can be maybe more rude or, inconsiderate of Asians without, fear of repercussions or retaliation.
I think there's also, it's just, sometimes just size too. I mean, typically
Right.
somebody is bigger. In my family, like I have two boys, and the one who's younger, he's starting to be taller than his brother, and his brother's starting to get intimidated by that, And so I think if you walk up to somebody who's taller and bigger, it's just naturally you may be more intimidated. So I think I want to also point out that this is something that I think as we were preparing for this, like we're processing a lot of this. And so we're in the midst of like just flushing it out too. So
yeah, and I think there's someone in the comments, it's less about, I think, threat. Well, I guess it can sometimes be perceived as threatening, but it's more about the perception of intimidation. And it's not that someone is trying to be intimidating. It's more that Asian Americans tend to look less intimidating rather than other communities or ethnicities looking more intimidating or threatening. It's more that Asian Americans kind of are overlooked in like a just because what, like Elaine and Isabel were mentioning, because of that, the smaller features, like very, very genetic and biological reasons, but the perception and that's also due to media, pop culture, lack of representation, and in roles that are more strong in a sense. And so it's not necessarily something that is done explicitly. It might be something that's very subconscious, but it is something that we've discovered in our research.
So I guess I'll just share really quick in terms of my story. I shared that my dad had cancer, and my story is similar to Elaine's in some ways. My dad had a specialist when he was first diagnosed. He was given about 3 to 6 months left to live, and he was just sharing, about the medical professional that he interacted with, that I don't think the care was satisfactory. And when I heard that, and working in end of life care, I was like, what are we going to do about this? And my dad was like, no, that's okay. That's okay. And I told him, you can switch to a different doctor. And so I think just culturally, my dad is, a gentle, he's more, I would describe him as like not the strong type of man who would speak up, but more gentle. And I think that was cultural too. And so he was like, no, that's okay. And I don't say this disrespectfully, but I think being an American-born Chinese, I have learned that when you speak up, when you're assertive, a lot of times that's how you get what you need. And for this situation, I was like, he only has a few months left, and we need him to get the best care. And I want it to be a good situation. So he, he didn't want to speak up about it himself. And I decided to take that step to advocate for him. And in the end, we end up getting a specialist that was a great fit for him. And I'm glad I did that. But I think if I hadn't done that, and I'm not trying to like praise myself, but I think my dad would have just accepted what he had. And so being non-confrontational and not wanting to speak up and not wanting to make waves, I think is kind of typical. So I just wanted to share that example. And then Meghna, did you have anything you wanted to share before we go on?
Yeah, kind of adding on to yours for a bit, the fear of stepping out of place, being seen as outsiders, it's not just Asian Americans, it could be any minority group. It assimilate into the general population. You don't want to ask questions or stand out. For our family, we're kind of since the 80s, Asians have been seen as job takers, and personally as a South Asian, 9/11 definitely affected the way we were treated and looked at in the community. And it makes, and it could be little things, it can sometimes be big things, but it could affect care, family experience, you know, you have to kind of advocate for yourself because there's just no other option. And I think for my family, a few challenges were health literacy and just knowledge of what's available. So, you know, we had a fear of the healthcare system, of being misunderstood, mistreated, sometimes related to language, but oftentimes also related to just, you know, respect, and would we be listened to and heard, or would our problems be minimalized? We just didn't, you know, we had some bad experiences, and so those were early on in the 2000s, but they carried over into our fear. My mom was the healthcare proxy for my paternal grandpa. She was his daughter-in-law, and normally it would have been my dad, but she worked in a hospital and she knew the healthcare system a little better. So she was a strong advocate. She spoke up and she asked questions and she challenged doctors sometimes. She got second opinions when necessary for my grandparents' health issues. And if she hadn't done that, you know, that was a big factor. That was a big help to us in understanding their medical needs, and getting more information out of our providers. Another kind of experience we had was that my grandma ended up in short-term rehab after a double stroke, and she was miserable there. You know, there was little staff, and she didn't speak. She had become slightly paralyzed and had lost the ability to speak, so she would make noises, and she recognized the family a little bit, but you know, she was scared. It was a new place, and it was mandated that she had to do it for occupational therapy and things like that for 6 weeks, I believe. And so whenever we went to visit her, we went every day, she was really worked up and she was terrified, and the staff at the time was worked up too. They were fed up and they didn't want her to be there. And it was really terrifying for us to leave her there every day because we just didn't know. We didn't know how she was being cared for. So that was, you know, one experience. And what we learned from that was, when we ended up taking my grandpa to adult daycare in 2008, the reason I went there, because he was starting to lose his speech and his memory and his ability to speak English. We were worried that he would be misinterpreted, that he might say something and not realize it was offensive because he didn't have a clear understanding of the English language. We didn't want the staff there to just think that that was normal, that was him, or to be offended or have any kind of, you know, bias against him because of something against his control. So when I went, I kind of helped him create a system or you know, like getting tea at this time, and helping him just get used to the adult daycare center as much as the staff got used to what his needs were, with me being a language conduit kind of for them. And when he would say something, if he didn't know how to say it right, for me to let them know, you know, this is what he meant by this. And then after the summer was over, I left, but for the rest of the time period, we were comfortable with him being there. He was comfortable with being there, and the staff knew what to do. So we learned from that.
So we often feel that we should sometimes serve as a middleman to serve our elders. I think I'm just going to ask you a quick question, actually, and you don't need to write this in the chat, but I think it just kind of sums up the challenges that Asian Americans sometimes face in healthcare and in general. But there was a survey that was put out by the Boston Globe. It was an article that I think Amanada may share with you, but where they asked people, I think it was over 2,500 people, who is the most prominent Asian American that you know? So I want you to think about that. You don't have to write it in the chat at all if you don't feel comfortable, but I just want you to reflect on that, because when they did that survey, what they found is, I think it was 42% of the American adults that were surveyed said the most common answer was they didn't know. The second was 11%, which was Jackie Chan, was the most prominent Asian American that they know, but Jackie Chan is actually not American. And then Bruce Lee was 9%. And so I read that, and I think that's one of the reasons why people don't know our stories. Somebody mentioned media, and I think the media doesn't tell our stories often, or our stories are downplayed. So even if we wanted to share our stories, maybe we don't, we won't. So we don't want to rock the boat, and oftentimes it's very easy to ignore the Asian American community. So we're going to go on to two misconceptions that I think we'll just kind of, we thought were important to bring up. I think language is often seen as a barrier, but we don't feel like that's the only barrier. So I think that's one of the misconceptions, that language is the main barrier to providing quality care. I think that communication within the family, and we kind of touched on this before, is probably an even greater barrier because there's so many dynamics. Each family has different generations who come, come to the US at a different time, or were born in the US, different generations, different educational levels within the same family. And it's just very complex to be communicating with each other. So I want to ask you guys, and we'll probably have to go through this a little faster, but what have been some barriers for you and your family, or share one barrier in terms of healthcare or end of life care? Meghna, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think the dignity and shame that we talked about as a similarity, as a challenge, it can also be considered kind of a misconception, because while we don't feel comfortable talking about weak health, and we don't feel comfortable talking about the ways in which we might be a burden to our family members, or we'd rather be at home, no strangers, that also makes us very insular and unable to accept help. And not having heard stories is a factor, like you mentioned. So I would say that misconception that we kind of would prefer to do it all at home, or not get anyone else involved. It is a weak point in the family, but it's a time where everyone can really come together. And you can even ask for outside help. We, in the last 6 months of my grandpa's Alzheimer's, it was becoming very difficult for us to take care of him. And he needed 24/7 care, and we were just not able to provide that, but we were desperate to keep him at home and comfortable. And so we ended up going outside to the community and left flyers places asking for a Hindi-speaking caretaker. And we ended up finding someone through our local Hindu temple, and a place that we had not visited that often because we were so busy with my grandpa. And he came and lived with us for 6 months. And it was a difficult time, bringing a stranger into the home to live with you full time, and to take care of your loved one who you love and care for on a personal level, and this is a stranger to them. So you want to make sure they're getting the best care possible, but sometimes the needs outweigh the concerns, in a sense. And at the end of the day, my grandpa needed that care. And so that misconception of kind of, we'd prefer to do it all on our own, we prefer not to bring strangers into the home. I think hospice care, especially end of life care, advanced care planning, there's teams that can really provide so much for you. And the problem is we just don't know that, whether for healthcare literacy reasons or exposure, or not hearing these stories. We just don't know how much help we could receive from the outside community, from the healthcare professionals, and how that might help us carry the burden of taking care of our loved ones. It's why I ended up working in hospice education, to help spread the word and reach families who could benefit from the care in the ways that our family ended up not being able to. Well, yeah, kind of. We joined Montgomery Hospice for about 1 week in 2010, but I always look back on that and think about how much my parents could have benefited from a day of respite, or how much my grandpa would have loved music therapy because he loved music. So those what ifs are constantly in my head, and they're kind of what drive me towards sharing this story.
I think whatever heritage that you have, I think it's just important to share your end of life stories, because that, I think word of mouth is one of the greatest ways to share with people the different services available in hospice care, definitely. So Elaine, why don't you go ahead and share?
Sure. A lot just about the communication piece, Isabel, that you were talking about. My family did not grow up talking to each other about anything beyond, have you eaten? How are things, at school? And it's not that we don't have, the full range of thoughts and emotions, but we're very devoted to keeping in our role. So talking about self-revealing things, whether it's the older person to the younger or the younger to the older, it's just not done. And and it also can seem self-centered, in where the welfare of the family is the most important thing. Like, you're not encouraged to share your little problems. And so there's that difficulty in the family, and the outside worker is especially challenged by this dynamic, but also has, a special power coming into that, to bring things up into the open in a way that is safe for all of the family members, potentially. All you can do is try.
I think this is why, and this might sound just very simple, but I think this is why it's so important in each of your roles as professionals, and I'm talking to all the attendees and participants, to provide good care. It doesn't matter who it is, because especially in the Asian American community, the doctor's word is taken, and what you share, or whether you're a social worker or a chaplain, whatever, what you share, we listen to that. And a lot of times we will not speak up or argue against that. So remembering that your words are very important. I think when it comes to, a lot of times in end of life care, we talk about, do you want to die in the home or the hospital? And this is something that I really thought of, is if you asked many Asian American patients, they probably aren't thinking, what do I want? Do I want to die in the hospital, or do I want to die in my home? They're often thinking about their family as a whole. So sometimes the question is not, what do you want? When they hear that question, they're often thinking something different. So I think that's something important to bring up. We're going to bring up the second misconception, which is that Asian Americans are self-sufficient and don't need more support or care. I think this goes along with the model minority idea. And I think part of that is because you don't hear our stories. And I know that does make it really hard for professionals to serve us. And that's why I think today is really valuable. So Meghna and Elaine, would you be able to share, do you feel like your family was self-sufficient? Did you need support? What is one need that your family had that you think that you could share to kind of help the professionals who are listening today?
It's interesting that my dad's experience in hospice opened my eyes to my own family, in several ways. My brother would come and visit, and he actually was there for one of the hospice visits. And our social worker, was talking to him about, how she wanted to support him, and was clearly using her skills of supportive listening. And I saw how meaningful that was to him. I saw tears in his eyes, and I was surprised. I was taken aback at how emotional he was, because he doesn't share that with me. So that is just one example that surprised me from my story.
I would say, we've talked about a lot of overlapping themes this hour, and obviously one need that our family had with the language barrier was huge, but just knowing what options were out there, what resources were out there, it felt like we were finding out about them as they were becoming less necessary for us, or as they became a moot point for us. And so it was this feeling of like, oh, this exists, but we can't use this anymore, or this isn't helpful to us anymore. So just knowing what options were out there, and that does come from stories. We heard about hospice from word of mouth. We heard about Montgomery Hospice from word of mouth, and it taught me, to be able to talk with your family about these issues, and to know, not just, with the grandparents, we couldn't do much about that at the end of it, but knowing about our parents' wishes and making sure that we feel more comfortable talking about these tough subjects, because, we are not models. We're all struggling. We all have our issues that are behind closed doors that others might not know about, and we really have to lean on each other for support. And even this webinar, I asked my parents for permission to share this story, because I felt so uncomfortable at the idea of sharing it and telling a bunch of strangers about it. And I was surprised at how okay with it they were. And even today, I at the very last minute asked them, like, did you guys want to watch this? So, it is something that we're constantly kind of battling, is that need to not take up space, but it's important to have these conversations and to listen. And I think that would make a huge difference, just for us to learn more about what's out there and to be treated equitably, and just not with any assumptions that we know what we're doing, we know what we're talking about, because it's a tough subject for everyone.
Exactly. And I just want to add to be careful about thoughts that, as we as workers, because we're also workers, be careful about the thoughts that are convenient. For instance, the doctors, that, did not take as much time to talk about the options or, the realities, because they can dismiss it as saying like, oh, they're Asian and they just want to handle it themselves within their own family, well, not only is that, wrong, it's convenient for the doctor, or the professional, whoever it is, and they're using unconscious attitudes about a group to make decisions. And that is called implicit bias. And that is the root of systemic racism, which is, someone in the audience was chatting about. And that is what we need to be so careful of. It's, we're all going to have certain biases because of the culture that we grow up in, but just to be aware, and ask ourselves, why we're making a decision we are.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Meghna, for sharing that. I think the only thing that I want to share is that part that when a lot of times, at least in my family and culturally, if somebody asks a question, we would say, I'm fine. And just to not be a troublemaker. And so sometimes we're not fine. We are not all good, because it doesn't mean that we don't have struggles. So to ask those questions, to ask again, knowing that oftentimes we are going to be holding back and we don't want to cause trouble, so we may not share things with you. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to just share some takeaways, because I think that's important to just close it out with that. Dr. Mei-Ching Lee was not here today, and so we wanted to share something that she shared with us. She said that diversity is important to appreciate and respect. No one wants to be stereotyped, but at the end of the day, our needs are the same. And end-of-life care consists of the same goals for everyone. Some of the other takeaways that we have, and I'm just going to run this through pretty quickly, is that to remember that Asian American patients and families, we do have needs. So ask questions, ask again. Sometimes we don't understand something, but we may say and nod our heads, we do. Continue to ask. Asian American patients and families have questions, but may often be holding back. And then really to remember that each Asian American family dynamic is so very different. You've heard 3 perspectives, and we've probably only shared a tiny bit with you. But the reluctance to share our story makes it really hard for you to understand the Asian American community. But I think when you take the time to listen to us, to understand, then we see you as a trusted partner. And we recognize that, and we will feel more open to share and to ask our questions. So quality care to Asian American patients and families: listen, observe, check in, don't assume that they're always fine. Ask questions to gain understanding, and then again, understand the complex family dynamic. So we want to respect your time. We know we went over a little bit, and we thank you for coming. If you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat box. And if we don't have time to answer it here, then we will make sure to follow up with you with a response. And I want to thank Elaine and Meghna for sharing your stories. I know it's not always easy, so thank you so much. And I'm going to hand the time back to Aminata to share some logistics.
Thank you guys. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Elaine and Meghna. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope this information was useful. This is a social work program, therefore a completed evaluation is required for a social work CEU. This program will also count towards, as an elective towards our certificate in end of life care. If you have any question that want to address during the presentation, send us an email and we will respond with the follow-up email. Let me know by responding to the follow-up email. Lastly, if you're interested in any of our program or get an update, you can contact me. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon, sorry.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.